From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Biden rebukes Israel, saying he's outraged by the deaths of 7 humanitarian aid workers in Gaza, as protest voters show dissatisfaction with the administration's handling of the war in yesterday's primary states.
We'll have more on the political potency of the Israel issue, as well as the crisis at our southern border and how it's impacting Democratic campaign efforts, in a conversation with Congresswoman Suzan DelBene, chair of the DCCC.
And we'll ask her about the path forward for Ukraine aid, which might not hit the House floor for weeks. Melinda Haring of the Atlantic Council will tell us how the delay is impacting the war on the ground. So we have much to discuss this evening, Joe, in terms of geopolitics and the influence it is having on domestic politics, from Ukraine aid and challenges that House Speaker Mike Johnson is facing to Israel and challenges that an incumbent president campaigning for re-election is facing in that regard.
Yeah, challenges that continue to get more complex, certainly now after what Israel says is the accidental killing of these 7 aid workers with the Jose Andres organization. We heard about this today at the White House, where Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre responded to a reporter's question about some of the comments that Joe Biden had about this. He had said earlier that Israel has not done enough to protect civilians. Here's the message from the White House today.
The president's statement was very, very strong, right? Very straightforward. He wants to see an investigation that's swift, an investigation that's comprehensive, that brings accountability, and he wants to make sure that it is made public. We leave it to obviously the Israeli government to do that investigation.
Joining us now, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams to start the conversation on this. Nick, we understand that there's going to be a meeting tomorrow. Joe Biden, Benjamin Netanyahu, a very critical time for them to speak. What's going to be the message from the White House?
Well, I think you're going to see the president reiterate his statement from last night, which was pretty extraordinary. I mean, it was one of those real sit-up and take notice moments when the president essentially rebukes an ally in such strong terms. So, I mean, there are a couple things going on here. One is the fact that the president obviously wants to condemn the killing of 7 people, humanitarian aid workers. World Central Kitchen says this was a deliberate strike by Israel, though Israel has denied that. Obviously, there's a ton of blowback on the president for continuing to offer essentially unallied support for Israel. So what you're seeing is a president who's really trying to balance condemnation against this horrific strike, but also the fact that the U.S. is going to keep on supporting Israel.
Well, you mentioned that World Central Kitchen is maintaining that this was intentional, despite the Biden administration suggesting that there is no evidence to suggest that. Jose Andres, of course, the founder and famed chef, gave an interview to Reuters in which he said this is not just a bad luck situation where, oops, we dropped the bomb in the wrong place. He went on to say the U.S. must do more to tell Prime Minister Netanyahu this war needs to end now. The difficulty is ending the war now may leave Hamas as a threat to Israel. And therein lies the rub for not just the Biden administration, but the Netanyahu government as well.
Right. And that's what you're seeing. I expect they'll talk about tomorrow. We should make clear, as you said at the top, Israel has vehemently denied that this was an intentional strike, and it would seem to go against all sorts of sort of ideas about what they have in terms of how they're prosecuting this war. But this is just a struggle we continue to see from the Biden administration. They have said, the president has said, listen, there are essentially no red lines with Israel. We are not going to condition military aid. We are going to keep up our support. We are going to make sure they can prosecute this war against Hamas. They have every right to do that. But then you have a succession of actions by Israel that keeps putting more and more pressure on President Biden and forces him to respond. The question I'm really looking for is, okay, what now? I mean, if you have another one of these attacks, you have starvation in Gaza, at what point does the president say things have to change here? We have to exert leverage on Israel in a much more meaningful way. And so far, we just haven't seen that.
This is happening as the White House continues to call on the House to act on the supplemental emergency funding request for not just Israel, but also Ukraine. Both of these have become more complex over time, and lawmakers are going to return to this next week. Speaker Johnson has some very difficult decisions to make here, doesn't he?
He does. And, you know, he's trying to tie this to a lot of different ideas, or maybe there's a way out of this where he can appeal to the real conservative base the conservatives in Congress who oppose the idea of Ukraine aid. I mean, it is this extraordinary situation where you have a president who's demanding the aid. Mike Johnson has said basically, yes, I want this aid to go ahead. The House overwhelmingly supports the aid, but Mike Johnson needs to appease these conservatives who could oust him as speaker if they don't get what they want. But what you're seeing really is President Biden saying, I'm not going to play these games. We're not going to do any horse trading. I want a straight up or down vote. We're going to have to see whether Mike Johnson is willing to take that on at the risk of his own speakership.
That could be sooner than later from what we understand. Indeed. He promised to vote after Easter. Nick, thanks for being with us. As always, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams. Elsewhere, both Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump taking wins in a host of primaries last night. But many voters still finding a way to push back against their party leaders. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Michelle Risco, who covers the White House with an eye on the campaign trail for us. Michelle, it's great to see you. The 4 states last evening included Wisconsin, which is awfully important to both of these potential paths to the White House for the Trump and Biden campaigns. And we saw pronounced protest votes against both of them. Let's start with Donald Trump. Nikki Haley pulled at least 10% in all of the states that we're talking about last night. What does that represent?
Yeah, that's right, Joe. And I think, voters would be forgiven for forgetting that yesterday was a multi-primary day. But yeah, indeed, those 4 states, resounding wins, if you can call them that, for both Biden and Trump. But really, so much of the country is exerting that sentiment that you mentioned. We had the North Texas guy last week registering as a presidential candidate under the name literally anybody else. I mean, it just really reflects how people are looking at this race with these 2 guys again. But specific to your point, in Wisconsin and other key battleground states, I think what you're seeing that's troublesome for the Biden campaign is there are those protest votes, whether it be for blank ballots in the case of New York or as undecided in some other primaries, largely representing what you were just talking about with Nick, dissatisfaction over the Biden administration's stance on Israel, Gaza. That is a huge thorn in the side of many Democrats right now. Also, you can imagine there is some dissatisfaction around economic issues that could cause some trouble at the ballot box in November for the Biden side. But of course, not so much popularity, for Trump, who's already battling in the courts, legal courts, but also in the court of public opinion, with Nikki Haley long been out of the race. And as you say, showing a formidable challenge in that regard in double digits in all 4 primary states.
Well, Michelle, I'm glad you raised the economic issues as well that may be weighing on the minds of voters, specifically inflation and the level of interest rates as a result of the inflation that we have seen. This is something that the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, talked about earlier today at an event in California. Take a listen.
These recent data do not, however, materially change the overall picture, which continues to be one of solid growth, a strong but rebalancing labor market, and inflation moving down toward 2%. On a sometimes bumpy path.
Michelle, what was really interesting about not just Powell's remarks, but the Q&A that happened afterward is he was talking about how it wasn't just demand that was driving inflation. That is something we hear often in Washington, especially from Republicans, this idea that it was all that fiscal stimulus, trillions of dollars getting poured into the economy, and that is why we were dealing with the inflation that we were. Powell kept coming back, though, to supply side issues. And I wonder if that just kind of speaks to the messaging disconnect between what people are feeling and what the reality is and how the Biden campaign is trying to bring those 2 things together.
Well, I don't envy Chair Powell's role as Fed chair in an election year where, everyone is going to try to throw the political question at him. But he did give that sort of dry economic response and trying to clarify, the broad apolitical analysis on what's going on in the economy. But I think, mainly what the comfort was out of Powell's speech and remarks today at that event were that no news is good news. He largely said the Fed is going to stay the course for now. They are, of course, watching those inflation readings, especially the past 2 that showed a little bit hotter inflation than expected. But for now, it's still stay the course. At some point this year is the phrasing in terms of having an interest interest rate cut, but nothing to be too excited about today.
And of course, the later the cut comes, the closer we will get to the presidential election. Bloomberg's Michelle Risco, thank you very much, as always, for joining us. Now, coming up, abortion and women's rights in the spotlight on the heels of a key court decision in Florida. Democratic House Leader Hakeem Jeffries putting the issue front and center as the campaign season heats up.
It's so important for us to make sure that all of us collectively do everything that we can to ensure that the amendment that will be before the people of Florida restores a woman's freedom to make her own reproductive health care decisions in November.
We'll speak more about that issue, how it's impacting campaigning and fundraising for the Democrats with the chair of the DCCC, Suzan DelBene, is joining us next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Trump brags about he's the reason Roe v. Wade was overturned. Here's his quote: "I did something no one thought possible. I got rid of Roe v. Wade," end of quote. And now he and his MAGA officials are calling for a national ban on the right to choose in every state. I promise you, with the Democratic Congress, Kamala and I will make Roe v. Wade the law of the land again. I promise you.
Democrats focusing on reproductive rights, as President Biden refers to there, as a key issue to help take control of the House in November. Yesterday's field hearing in Florida is one example of this. Another, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee's efforts at putting IVF-related ads up in vulnerable Republican districts around the country. The DCCC is tasked with getting Democrats elected to the House, so we're joined by the chair right now, Congresswoman Suzan DelBene of Washington. Congresswoman, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. The president says it all there. If you're going to take the House for him to restore Roe v. Wade, is abortion the issue that you will use to get there?
Well, I think it's been pretty clear that abortion and reproductive freedom have been on the ballot every day since the Dobbs decision. Over and over and over again, we've seen special elections where people have stood up to fight to protect reproductive freedom, whether it's in Ohio or Kentucky or Wisconsin or Virginia, or even more recently, you saw a big Democratic win in a state legislative race in Alabama. Folks know that Republicans are pushing for a nationwide abortion ban. They're very clear about it. More and more information comes forward about their efforts, whether it's in Florida most recently or the Supreme Court decision in Alabama. They're trying to take away reproductive rights, and the people aren't going to stand for it. And we've seen huge turnout in elections over and over again, standing up for reproductive freedom, and I expect that is going to continue.
Well, in Florida specifically, after that decision from the court, there were murmurs here in Washington about whether or not that actually might put Florida back in play as a swing state rather than a firmly red one. Do you see opportunities there for Democrats now that weren't there a few days ago, or is that overly optimistic about the likelihood of change that swift in today's political climate?
Well, I think it's really clear that Republicans are out of step with where the American people are. The American people want to stand up for rights and freedoms and for our democracy. And when it comes to reproductive rights and reproductive freedom, Republicans are on the wrong side. They continue to try to undermine reproductive freedom, whether it's access to in vitro fertilization, whether it's abortion rights and health care. And so we're going to see people turn out, and I expect we're going to see a lot of people turn out in Florida as well.
A lot of the message that we've been hearing from Democrats like yourself running for re-election or running for election against this ever-shrinking Republican majority in the House is dysfunction. Congresswoman, when lawmakers return, including yourself, next week, and the matters of Ukraine and Israel are brought up, what role will Democrats play in helping to get these passed, or do you not see it happening under this speaker?
Well, it's been dysfunction, it's been chaos, and it's been extremism from the Republican side from day one of this Congress, whether it's the 15 rounds of votes before they were able to elect Speaker McCarthy then to where we are today. We've been on the brink of shutdowns. We finally got government funding through halfway through the fiscal year. They're incapable of governing, and there is no leadership. And when it comes to moving other important legislation, like making sure that we are able to support Ukraine, Speaker Johnson has been incapable of making a decision on how to move forward. But there's really one decision. There's a bipartisan bill that went through the Senate that he can put on the House floor right away, and it would pass. And so the only reason there hasn't been progress here is because Speaker Johnson refuses to put legislation on the floor. This is about leadership and having folks make sure they're doing the right thing to continue to address the issues facing our country. There's just no leadership on the Republican side. Folks are too scared to move forward on anything. Let's let folks vote. And frankly, the only way things are going to move forward is if there's bipartisan support. So this is another case where it's important that we have bipartisan support and we move bipartisan legislation.
Well, Congresswoman, as you speak of what you perceive to be weakness in leadership on the Republican side, what about weakness in leadership at the utmost rungs of the leader ladder in Democratic politics? President Biden, by all accounts, based on the data and polling that we are seeing, is an incredibly unpopular incumbent president. And most polls show that he is losing to Trump, not just nationally, but in the swing states that ultimately could decide the outcome of this election. How worried are you about the impact that President Biden may have down the ballot in terms of voter enthusiasm and turnout?
I've been all across the country to swing districts all across the country. And, you talk to folks these are purple districts. These are places where you have independents, probably folks who are former Republicans who don't know what happened to their party, and others who want to see folks who are going to go to Washington, D.C. to govern, who are going to find solutions to the issues facing our country and help move us forward. And they want folks who are going to stand up for our rights, our freedoms, and our democracy. And when I've talked to voters across the country, they are looking for those strong leaders, and we have them. Our incumbents and our candidates who are running against Republicans in swing districts across the country really are authentic leaders who are addressing issues, talking to their communities about the challenges they face, and putting forward real solutions. And that's what this is about. That's why we've seen success even more recently in New York 3, where on the Long Island seat, where we had a great Democratic candidate, now a congressman again, who spoke to issues facing the community, a Republican candidate who was afraid to talk to people and talk about where she stood. That made the difference.
Yeah, Tom Suozzi talked a lot about the border. Congresswoman Suzan DelBene, Democrat from Washington and chair of the DCCC, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And coming up, we'll have more on the politics of the border, specifically with our Texas Bureau Chief, Julie Fine. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Immigration and the border are front and center on the campaign trail. A Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll finding that issue is second only to the economy as top of mind for voters. And it's the subject of this week's Big Take story, where we take a closer look at what's happening specifically on the Texas border.
For years, federal officials, lawmakers, and residents along the 2,000-mile border with Mexico have grappled with how to handle people who illegally cross into the U.S. As Border Patrol encounters hit records, it's arguably exposed the U.S. immigration system as an underfunded, opaque, and obsolete relic that's bursting at the seams. In April 2022, Governor Abbott decided federal authorities weren't doing enough about increased border crossings. He directed the Texas Division of Emergency Management to charter buses to take people who entered the U.S. illegally to northern cities, or as he called them, sanctuary cities.
With each bus, Abbott has made this an issue that has just burst onto the 2024 scene. It was impossible for Eric Adams to ignore in New York. The Democrats were compelled to do something.
That, in turn, made it a critical problem for one person above all: President Joe Biden.
Biden agreed to a bill that included a lot of stuff that Democrats very recently would never have agreed to, but it just collapsed. Donald Trump made it clear he opposed it. House Republicans followed Trump. One of the takeaways I think that's lost here is that this might have been the only shot.
Joining us now for more on this story is our Texas Bureau Chief, Julie Fine, who was part of this reporting trip to the U.S. border. So, Julie, just tell us more about what exactly you witnessed and what you heard, not just from border officials, Border Patrol officials and Texas state officials there, but actual migrants who have just made this journey and are doing the crossing themselves.
Well, you know, you've heard a lot about Eagle Pass. It's certainly been in the news because of so many border crossings. What's very interesting, first of all, about migrants coming over is there's an increased presence now, and there is border wire. So what you're seeing are fewer people coming through Eagle Pass. But that wire, I have to tell you, for people that have traveled 4 months, 2 months, they're going to figure out a way to get there. And that's basically what we heard from migrants that we spoke to. I mean, a lot of the migrants told us they're just hoping for a better life. They're looking for a better life. Some were fearing for their lives. So that's why they decided to make this trip here.
We heard from Donald Trump over the weekend in Grand Rapids, where he referred to migrants as prisoners, murderers, drug dealers, mental patients, and terrorists, who he said the countries are sending the worst they have. Can you help us understand who is crossing the border here, Julie Fine? Because we understand from immigration officials that there are many cases poor families escaping poverty.
There are many cases where there are poor families escaping poverty. There are many cases where people come because of fear of the cartels. Now, are there drug traffickers? Are you hearing about drugs coming over the border? Yes, but there are also people that just really want to come to America and join their families here. So it is interesting because when you are on the border, you see several things. You see how porous it is. Like, when you move this many people into Eagle Pass, migrants are going to find other areas to cross the border. But everybody, even those helping migrants, will say clearly this system is not working right now. I think that's the one thing there's a lot of agreement on.
Well, I want to point everyone to the big take on the terminal and online at Bloomberg.com. Bloomberg's Julie Fine helping to lead our coverage. Julie, thank you. This is Bloomberg.
There are a lot of factors that indicate that Ukraine is not only winning, but will come out victorious in the end, provided we give them this assistance. The frozen assets are $330 billion. If Ukraine can get that, it will for sure outlast Russia in this war.
That was Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University, talking with us here on Bloomberg. Joining us now is Melinda Haring, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, as we anticipate lawmakers return to Washington next week and what will likely be a concerted debate over Ukraine funding. Melinda, it's great to see you. I know that you were calling for this funding to be passed last calendar year. Now that we're here now and this debate is taking place, we're talking about a potential loan. No one seems to know exactly what form legislation will take or what the give and take might be with Democrats. Is what Evelyn Farkas is talking about the answer, using seized money from Russia, which would far outweigh the amount of money that we're talking about here in Washington? Is that the answer to Ukraine's funding problems right now?
Hey, Joe, it's great to be with you. It's part of the solution. So the bill that we expect to see next week when Congress comes back into session, it really all depends on Speaker Mike Johnson. He's given an interview and he's given us a preview of what to expect. He said three things. He said he wants to include the $300 billion in Russian state assets, the Repo Act that Evelyn just spoke to you about. He wants to include loans. And you're right, he has not been specific about which part of the assistance would be loans and which would be a gift. And then the third element, he's talking about how he wants President Biden to authorize more natural gas contracts. He froze those. And the question is this the package that he's going to put on the floor? And is it palatable? Will the Democrats sign on to this? And so far, the Democrats don't like the sound of it. They like repo. They're fine with repo. They don't like loans. And there's reasons to be worried about loans. If the money that the U.S. were to give, including military assistance, were loans, it would take a lot longer to get that assistance to Ukraine. So that's one thing I'm worried about. And then I think the one other option, the best option, is if Speaker Johnson puts the Senate bill that passed already on the floor and we have a vote on it. That is the cleanest, fastest option to get Ukraine the weapons that it needs as soon as possible.
Well, it doesn't really seem, though, that that's the likely option that Mike Johnson is going to pick, considering that he potentially has his entire speakership hanging in the balance should Marjorie Taylor Greene actually act on a motion to vacate. But just on the idea of time here, Melinda, you say that a loan might take too long. The longer that this takes, what actually happens to Ukraine's war effort on the ground? What is happening right now, and what could be happening 6 weeks from now?
That's a great question, Kayleigh. So American credibility is on the line. I think the most interesting thing we saw today was NATO come out and say, we are putting a $100 billion 5-year package to Trump-proof Ukraine assistance together. And the United States is raising its hand and asking questions and saying, we don't really like this, we're uncomfortable with this. But the Europeans got the message. They're not sure that we are a reliable ally. So they are taking over. But in terms of what's happening on the ground, it's making it awfully difficult for the Ukrainians to hold the front line. The Ukrainians have changed their tune and they are building defensive fortifications. Finally, they needed to do that months ago, but they are doing that now. People are very nervous about Kharkiv Oblast in particular, that the Ukrainians are going to stage some kind of major counteroffensive in the next couple of months there. But it's going to be harder and harder to hold the line without American assistance.
We heard today from Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General. Melinda, tomorrow is the 75th anniversary of the alliance. He spoke earlier to reporters in Brussels. Let's hear what he said, and we'll have you answer on the other side.
Burden sharing is always top on our agenda. When NATO made the pledge to invest 2% of GDP on defense back in 2014, only 3 allies met that target. Today, 2/3 of NATO allies are spending 2% of GDP on defense. That's significant progress, but of course we want more allies. We want all allies to be at 2%, and 2% is a minimum. So this is a message that I and we all convey very strongly as we prepare for the upcoming Washington summit.
Add all this up, Melinda Haring, and Stoltenberg is proposing to establish a fund now of allied contributions worth $100 billion for Ukraine. This would be a 5-year timeline. Is that a more sustainable long-term approach to funding Kyiv?
Absolutely. So Europe has gotten the message. They're not certain what's going to happen in the United States between our Congress and the possibility of Donald Trump returning to office and potentially zeroing out Ukraine assistance. And he could undermine our position in NATO as well. Europe has woken up and they want to make sure that Ukraine has the assistance it needs. So they're putting this 5-year plan together, and it's excellent. Right on is the message. But when you dig in and look at the 2% target that the Secretary General is talking about, you know, the countries that talk a big game but actually don't deliver, my eyes are on them. So all eyes are on France, Italy, and Spain. They're not at 2%, and France in particular is talking a heck of a game, right? They made news last week talking about strategic ambiguity, and it's time to have a more intelligent policy. Yes, they have sent long-range rockets, awesome, but they actually haven't sent very much assistance, and someone needs to call them out on that.
Well, and it's interesting because it is France, specifically the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who has, in the not-so-distant past, floated the idea that actually sending troops to Ukraine wouldn't be off the table. And that's often where these conversations go, Melinda. When people are advocating for this aid, they make the argument that it's Ukrainian soldiers fighting so that your soldiers don't have to. Do you see us getting to the point, if we're talking about Ukraine needing support for 5 years, that this war is ongoing to the point where the only thing that brings it to the end would be actual more forceful presence than just the Ukrainian forces themselves?
I don't think we should rule it out. And that was the point that Emmanuel Macron made last week. He said, look, we have to stop being so transparent in telling the Russians exactly what we will and will not do. Is it possible that Western allies are going to have to put troops on the ground to fight in a combat role to end this war? It's absolutely possible. It depends on Vladimir Putin, and will he be dissuaded from fighting? No one sees him waving a white flag, so it's possible.
All right, Melinda Haring of the Atlantic Council, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. We appreciate your time. Now coming up, we'll turn back to last night's primaries in Wisconsin, New York, Connecticut, and more with our political panel. Bad news maybe for both Trump and Biden in those results. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Folks know that Republicans are pushing for a nationwide abortion ban. They are very clear about it. More and more information comes forward about their efforts, whether it's in Florida most recently or the Supreme Court decision in Alabama. They're trying to take away reproductive rights, and the people aren't going to stand for it. And we've seen huge turnout in elections over and over again.
That was the chair of the DCCC, the congressional campaign arm, at least for the Democrats, Congresswoman Suzan DelBene of Washington, on with us just a few moments ago. And joining us now for more on this conversation is Lisa Camuso-Miller, former RNC Communications Director and the host of the Friday Reporter podcast, and Kristen Hahn of Rock Solutions. Great to see both of you ladies here in our Washington studio. So we heard from Suzan DelBene about this. We heard from her and several other Democratic lawmakers down in Florida at a field hearing yesterday about this. And we've heard from the president himself about this in the last several days. He is clearly, Kristen, trying to make abortion one of those issues that he is most starkly trying to draw a contrast between himself and Trump on. The question is this the issue when Trump is touting the border and everything else that we are seeing Trump talking about going to be the one that actually helps him more in these swing states where he still is behind him?
Yes. I think you're looking at this issue. I think a lot of times, Democrats should be talking about the border. We should be talking about how President Trump derailed a potential solution to a lot of what's going on at the border right now. But we're winning when we're talking about health care, women's health care, and reproductive health care. We knew that from the last two election cycles. It's even more stark now. You'll see the president just released a 30-second ad that he's running in the Midwest. Clearly divides the line. You saw his response to Trump saying, we'll release a statement next week on abortion. Well, you already made your statement, Donald Trump. You said you took credit for Roe v. Wade being overturned. So I think this is a winning issue for Democrats, winning issue among women, particularly in those states. So, yes.
I'm glad you mentioned Donald Trump. I'm not sure we will actually get an announcement next week. He's done that with a lot of things, including his health care plan. But if, in fact, that's the case, he told reporters yesterday, Lisa, he would give us an idea next week of how many weeks a ban he might support nationally. How important will that announcement be?
The longer this issue remains part of the conversation, the more Republicans are losing. And that's really what this comes down to. He has been very much celebrating the fact that he feels very good about the way the Supreme Court has behaved. But he really gets a little bit wishy-washy when it comes to the amount of weeks or a variety of other issues. This is really not an issue he wants to be talking about. And so it surprises me that he says that he needs to get in front of it, say what it is, and be on to the other issues that I think are at hand. But right now, having this conversation in states like Florida puts states that ordinarily would be Republican states back in play.
Well, it wasn't Florida that had primaries yesterday. It was New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin. And both for Donald Trump and Joe Biden, there is a chunk of the primary electorate that is choosing not them. Many voting for Nikki Haley in the case of Trump, but in the case of Joe Biden, There was a sizable vote for uncommitted or uninstructed in the case of Wisconsin. That's a protest vote based off of the administration's policies surrounding Israel and the war ongoing in Gaza. The White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, got a question about whether policy has changed toward Israel in light of the deaths of 7 humanitarian aid workers for World Central Kitchen earlier this week, and this was her response.
I can say that nothing has changed, and we've been clear about that since certainly since yesterday. We are going to continue to have those really tough conversations, right? Important, tough conversations about how Israel moves forward with their operation. We want to make sure that civilians are kept safe, that are protected.
Kristen, is saying nothing has changed in regard to your policy going to be something that changes the mind of those voters who are choosing uninstructed or uncommitted, or does something have to change if the president wants to count on those votes?
I mean, I think he's trying to balance his actual policy with the politics right now. It's a horrible situation. He's been put in a very, very difficult spot. Yes, I think something's going to have to change. I also think that these protest votes don't necessarily translate to the general election. I think when it becomes very clear that you're going to have Donald Trump in the White House or Joe Biden, that people are going to ultimately choose Joe Biden. So I don't think it's, 1 for 1 here. But yes, I think something's going to have to move on the issue.
You wonder how much of this is noise in the primary season, how comfortable people feel when it's a state like Connecticut where there's not a lot of drama and whether Joe Biden's going to win this. The stakes will be so different in November. Voters know that, right?
I absolutely think so, and I agree with Kristen here. I think that this is an issue where voters have an opportunity to send a message to the president and let him know that they're unhappy with his policies. But when it comes down to getting into the general election and what their decision's going to be, it is more likely that it's going to be. And to your point, Joe, there's a lot more flexibility in states like Connecticut because they already know how that state's going to end up for Joe Biden ultimately.
Well, but it also, we keep characterizing it as, they'll make a different decision in November. They could also just not decide at all. They could just not cast a vote. I just wonder if, first and foremost, this is a turnout issue more than anything else.
Yes, absolutely, yes. I mean, and that's the other thing, too, is that what does it come down to? What is it that they're turning out for? Are they turning out for policies in the Middle East? Are they turning out for policies as it relates to immigration? Are they turning out for women's reproductive rights issues? That is really what it's going to come down to. Those three, and the economy always is the biggest piece of this, too. And that's the one thing that really each of these candidates is going to have to fight for, and that's the turnout in November, for sure.
And he's got a lot of money to do that. When you look at Joe Biden's timeline here, time you could argue is on his side for a lot of issues, waiting for the economy to resolve itself, the inflation issue, but also organizing. When you start putting money behind this ground game, you start talking about turnout like Kaylee is referring to. He's got time to make this happen.
He's got time, and he's got the team who knows how to build a really strong ground game. I think time to resolve these issues is one thing. We never know what's going to be the October surprise, however. But I think that, as far as getting the boots on the ground, recruiting the volunteers, talking to people, getting the message out, he's still got a lot of time.
Coming up with our panel, special counsel Jack Smith criticizing the Florida judge presiding over Trump's federal documents case. We'll be back with more of our panel on that and some of the weaknesses facing Donald Trump in the primary results from last night. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Voters hit the polls, as we've been discussing, in several states yesterday for presidential primaries. Results showing some warning signs for both President Biden, as we just discussed, as well for Donald Trump, as we'll discuss now with our political panel. Lisa Camuso-Miller, former RNC communications director, is with us, host of the Friday Reporter podcast, along with Kristen Hahn of Rock Solutions. So, Lisa, Donald Trump can't seem to shake Nikki Haley. And this is interesting to me because in Georgia, the idea was, well, she hadn't dropped out yet when early voting began. But let's look at some of these states last evening. She took at least 10% of the vote in all four, and in one case got 15% almost. Is this just noise for Donald Trump, or does he have as much to worry about as Joe Biden?
Oh, I think he has as much to worry about as Joe Biden. I think that there's a big chunk of the Republican electorate that really doesn't want him to be the nominee. And they're exercising their right in the primary, regardless of who the nominee is, to let them know that they're not happy with who the selection is that the early states have made for them.
Well, it begs the question of that group of voters, the same as the uninstructed and uncommitted voters that we were talking about. What will change their minds? If you are a voter who would have cast a ballot for Nikki Haley and Trump now has to convince you, is doubling down on language like there is a bloodbath at the southern border, as we saw the president do yesterday in Grand Rapids, or that migrants are animals, is that a way for him to win over those people, or is that just a way for him to further galvanize the base that he already has?
It is absolutely not a strategy to get those people to come over to his side, Kayleigh, at all. And the one thing I will say is that if they're smart, and I think that the campaign operation really is built of a lot of really smart political operatives, they're going to start identifying some really smart surrogates that can talk to people that are not happy with Donald Trump as the nominee and start using language that's a lot more in line with the way that they feel about the Republican Party or with the way the party used to be in order to get them to come and join their effort to win back the White House.
Your former RNC is up with a website called BidenBloodbath.com as Donald Trump tries to embrace this term bloodbath that he was originally criticized for using. It highlights violent crimes committed by undocumented immigrants aimed directly at the president. How does the Biden campaign respond to that?
I mean, I think that they've got to, at some points, you have to get down the dirt and fight with somebody. I think they really need to rise above this. I mean, this is the president, the former president, who plays on people's fears. We saw him do it last time around. It did work last time around. I think we're better prepared to fight it this time around. But, you know, I mean, you're using people's pain and these terrible tragedies for your political gain. I think ultimately it will turn people off.
Yeah.
Well, and I wonder if the fear, or perhaps the fear that we could see this former president one day be incarcerated or further victimized by the Justice Department, if you believe his arguments, is going to continue driving money towards him, because we haven't seen it to the same extent for Trump or for the RNC as an institution that we've seen for Biden and the Democrats. The DNC is far ahead. So how much of this is going to be a money thing, first and foremost, Lisa?
Oh, it's absolutely a money play, and they're already bragging today about how their March numbers have been better. The RNC, and the party itself, the campaign itself, are saying that money is up, and that shrinks the margin between them and Joe Biden. I mean, he has just, to your point about this new website, about the bloodbath and all these other things, he has just put all of his cronies and daughter-in-law and others in charge of the RNC for that very reason, because they are absolutely an outreach and an arm of whatever it is the former president wants to say and wants to do. And so we're going to see more and more of that. But this is absolutely the most explosive and exciting language that they can use in order to draw in dollars, in order to raise money.
We had news today from New York, Donald Trump's legal side of the story here. The judge presiding over this hush money case, this is the Stormy Daniels case that's set to begin later on this month, rejecting an immunity claim that the president has made immune from criminal charges. Are we going to look back at this as an important turning point as he prepares to go on criminal trial?
It feels that way to me. I mean, I'm not an attorney by trade, but I would say that each and every one of these moves are so unprecedented and are so brand new to all of our elective process. We've talked in the past about, will we elect someone that belongs behind bars? Will he be behind bars when he's elected? All of these questions, I think, are history-making moments and ones we're going to have to watch.
Yeah, he very well could be a convicted felon and therefore not able to vote for himself in November, because that's the way the law works. But of course, it becomes a question of whether that actually will happen, or whether any of the trials beyond the one in New York that is not going to be delayed will begin on April 15th will go forward. To what extent are Democrats in the Biden campaign reliant on one of those trials at least happening?
I don't think the campaign's reliant on any of these things. I mean, we've seen the president be Teflon, even coming up against, things that would take down any other politician. So I don't think I would say that the campaign's reliant on anything other than, taking advantage of his missteps, pointing out and making sure voters know exactly who this man is and who they're voting for, what the president has accomplished, and getting those boots on the ground and making sure that we get those voters out in November.
Making sure that the courtroom is not a viable campaign platform?
I mean, yes. I mean, the courtroom.
He's been making it work so
far.
He's
been making it work, and he wants these judges to issue gag orders. I wish they weren't called gag orders. Because he's using it to fundraise. He's using it to make his point, which is unfortunate.
All All right, Kristen Hahn and Lisa Camuso-Miller, our wonderful political panel this evening. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us.
Check out the Washington Edition newsletter to follow up on all the stories we talked about today. You can find it on the terminal and online.
And you'll find us back here tomorrow. Thanks so much for joining us this evening on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.